I want to welcome you to another video Drasha. This week's Parsha is Vayigash, and we are continuing with the story of Joseph and the brothers. And I want to begin this week again by mentioning something that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote about. And this should be Le'ilui Nishmato, that his soul should have an elevation. But Rabbi Sacks said that although Freud thought that the key to understanding conflict in human life was to understand the rivalry between father and sons, the book of Genesis rather sees the rivalry between brothers, between siblings, as the core of human conflict. And of course, we can point to the murder by Cain of his brother Abel. That is the first murder in the Bible. And in every generation of the patriarchs, we see instances of sibling rivalry. Abraham has two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael is ultimately expelled from the family. Then Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. Of course, this story of sibling rivalry is really, at the very center of the Jacob story. They already begin to struggle in utero, so that Jacob emerges from the womb clutching the heel of his brother Esau as if he was trying to overtake him in order to be the firstborn. Eventually, of course, Jacob does force Esau to sell his firstborn status for a bowl of soup. Then later on, there is again this story that I think is one of the most dramatic in the Torah, of how Jacob tricks his father Isaac into giving him the blessing that he had intended for Esau. And in order to accomplish this, Jacob actually pretends to be his brother Esau. He puts on Esau's clothes. And so there is this tremendous rivalry, and it produces a great tension and conflict between the two, so much so that Esau threatens to murder Jacob, and as a result, Jacob has to flee his home, where he goes off back to Haran, where Abraham had come from. And there he marries two sisters. And then we have the interesting case of seeing sibling rivalry from the point of view of two sisters who were jealous of one another and who competed with one another. And then Jacob, of course, has the 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. And there is this story of sibling rivalry between Joseph and his brothers. And the fact is that Jacob made no effort to conceal his preference for Joseph. The fact is that Joseph was the eldest son of his beloved wife, Rachel. And he favored Joseph. He gave him, of course, the famous coat of many colors, which was a symbol of his affection. And, an interesting thing is if you got a special suit of clothes from your father, some really special garment, seems to me I would probably hang it up in the closet. I would be very protective of it. And then, once in a while on a special occasion, you would bring out this garment and put it on. But it seems clear from the story in the Torah that Joseph wore this tunic around all the time. Because when he goes off to check on his brothers and the flock, his father Jacob asks him, go see how your brothers and the flock are doing. He's wearing that garment just to go on a little trip to see how things are going. And when the brother sees him and they throw him into the pit and they tear off his garment and ultimately they dip it into blood and, of course, use that garment to trick their father into thinking that Joseph had been killed by wild animals. So the real emblem of this rivalry is the coat of many colors. And this case of sibling rivalry reaches a point where the brothers plot to kill Joseph. Instead, they end up, again, throwing him into a pit and selling him to traders who were going down to Egypt. So this is perhaps the greatest case of sibling rivalry in the Torah, and it is between the brothers who are ultimately going to be the tribes of Israel. But this is also the case of sibling rivalry that reaches a resolution. There is a reconciliation that takes place in this week's Torah portion, and it really begins with the first word of the portion. We said the name of this Parsha is Vayigash, which means, and he came near. And the Torah, the portion begins saying Judah came close to him, meaning to Joseph. And this is perhaps the first time that the brothers have actually had a closeness, that they became close. What is ironic about it is that Judah doesn't know that it is his brother Joseph. But after Judah's approach, Joseph can no longer control himself, and he weeps out loud and reveals himself to his brothers. I am Joseph. Imagine this scene. You know, I've always thought that this must be one of the greatest scenes in all literature. I mean, think about this, right? The brothers who had plotted to kill Joseph, and he was 17 years old when they got rid of him. And they assumed, probably, who knows what they assumed ever happened to him. But now they're down in Egypt, and this person who they believe is an Egyptian, who they believe is, the Grand Vizier there in Egypt, who's been sort of playing games with them and putting them through some harrowing experiences. All of a sudden, this guy sort of pulls off his mask and says, "Guess what? I'm Joseph." You can just imagine the shock that caused. And so Joseph immediately tries to calm them down. And he does so by saying, don't blame yourselves. Don't, reproach yourselves, because this was ultimately part of God's plan, that God sent me ahead to Egypt in order to save your lives, because there are still 5 years left in this famine. And so God set things up in this way, that I came to Egypt before you. And so even though, yes, you were the ones who threw me into the pit, and you were the ones who ultimately sold me to the traders who brought me to Egypt, but that was all part of a divine plan to get me to Egypt ahead of you. And I think that we can even go so far as to say that this divine plan was to save the Jewish people. After all, again, the brothers are the progenitors of the tribes of Israel. These are the children of Israel, the sons of Israel. And therefore, this divine plan that brought Joseph to Egypt and made him second in command there was all done for the purpose of saving the Jewish people, who might otherwise have perished in the famine. And so Joseph and the brothers do reach a certain reconciliation. And I think this is also a great example. It is perhaps the best example in the Torah of teshuvah, of repentance. Because let's remember that Maimonides, in his Hilchot Teshuvah, the laws of Tshuva, in his great work, the Mishnah Torah, he says that true repentance, perfect repentance, is that you sin and now you're put into the same circumstance again, and this time you choose not to sin. And so Joseph, through all of his conniving and maneuvering with the brothers there in Egypt, because after all, he knew who they were and they didn't know who he was, all of this was really designed to set up the scenario to see would the brothers act differently this time. And so he maneuvers to make them bring Benjamin down to Egypt. Originally, they had left Benjamin at home because Jacob wasn't willing to let him go. Remember, again, Benjamin is the favored son, just like Joseph. He's the child of Rachel. And Joseph and Benjamin are full brothers. They're only half brothers with the others, who are, of course, the sons of Leah and the two concubines. So the fact is, Joseph gets Benjamin brought down to Egypt, and he showers him with favors. He makes it very clear that he has a preference for Benjamin. He gives him gifts and gives him more than he gives the other brothers. So he sets up this same scenario that Jacob had favored him. And then he connives to create a situation where Benjamin is accused of stealing his chalice, and he's imprisoned. And then he says to the brothers, okay, you're free to go. You didn't do anything. But he's staying in prison. So now the question is, will the brothers act to save Benjamin, even though he's been favored, even though he is the son of Rachel, even though he is, the favored one? Will they risk themselves to save him, or will they leave him in jail? Leave him in the pit? As a matter of fact, it's interesting, in Hebrew, the word for pit is sometimes used also for the prison. And therefore, the fact that Benjamin is in prison is very similar to the fact that they left Joseph in the pit. So are they going to leave Benjamin in the pit, or are they going to come forward? And again, that's where this week's Torah portion begins, with Judah coming forward, approaching Joseph to plead for the life of Benjamin. And this is therefore the evidence that they have done teshuvah. And hence this reconciliation of the brothers, I think we can say, is a genuine reconciliation. And therefore the book of Genesis does end on a hopeful note, that with all of these instances of sibling rivalry and all of the tension and even violence that has taken place, that ultimately there is hope for humanity. Because in the case of Joseph and his brothers, there was a resolution to their rivalry. So I want to wish you all a good Shabbos, and I'm hoping that everyone is still staying safe and being careful. And I hope that when you read the Torah portion this week, you will find these remarks to be of some benefit. Good Shabbos.